Hello and a very warm welcome back to the garden. In this video I want to talk about productive no-dig gardening in raised beds with sides. There's a lot of discussion these days about whether you should or shouldn't have sides, especially if you're in a slug-prone climate like I'm in. Now that's what we'll explore in this video and why I choose to stick with raised beds with sides. And on top of that, no-dig has so many benefits for us as a method for growing food. Not only does it make it easier, but more importantly, it supports a really healthy soil life. Before I properly go into the reasons as to why I choose sides, I just want to talk about how easy it is to convert kind of a dug bed into a no-dig bed. And all it means is in the winter or even early spring, now is an absolutely perfect time to do it, is to put on a load of compost. So no-dig is most compost intensive when you are converting. So you want to put on about 5 to 6 centimeters of really well broken down compost over the bed. And then what you want to do after that is to keep it maintained. So you only need to put on a layer on a yearly basis of around 2 to 3 centimeters of compost. So it's about half as much compost than you need in the first year. And all you do is you just rake it over the top, which is what I'm going to do now. And the whole idea with no-dig is because you're just applying it like a layer over the surface of the soil, you're doing what basically happens in nature. The leaves fall down, they break down, and they apply that surface covering and surface mulch. We're just doing the exact same, but in a garden sense. There are so many reasons as to why I choose to grow raised beds with sides, but I kind of want to do a little disclaimer to begin with. Whether you're growing in raised beds with sides or without sides, there's no right or wrong about it. I think it's very easy to forget the reasons why we choose to garden and grow food in the first place. And I think fundamentally, the most important thing is that we're doing the thing that we perhaps enjoy the most. And for me personally, it's very much about having raised beds with sides, but for other people, it's about having raised beds without sides, or even looking at containers or other types of beds. And all of them work. All of them have their own positives, all of them have their own negatives. But crucially, what we need to do is to choose a style that ultimately we enjoy the most. And it might mean that we might have to take little sacrifices as a result of that. But ultimately, it's about the satisfaction that comes from growing and what makes sense to you the most. So I'm going to go through the reasons why I personally choose and stick with raised beds with sides, and then also highlight perhaps a bit of the downfalls that come with those. The big thing about no-dig is an emphasis on reducing or having minimal disruption on the actual soil. So one of the downsides of this actual garden here is that there used to be big barns here back in the day. So very soon, if you start digging down, you're going to hit a concrete layer, which means that in terms of water saturation, it kind of just puddles. So we need the height of the raised beds for that. Now I could go for raised beds without sides, but one of the things here actually having a wetter climate is because I want to have as much versatility as possible, so all of the beds are pretty high. It means, well, firstly, it's better on my back because I can just sit on the side here. You've got the side that you can sit on, use as a seat, and you can just go ahead and do your gardening and your working. And I also like to use the sides as cup holders as well. But the other thing that happens is if you have a lot of heavy rainfall like I do here in Ceredigion in Midwest Wales, if I had this kind of height, I would be worried about the rain not washing the nutrients away, but actually washing the soil away if I didn't have these sides, especially on a slope as well, because these are almost contained units, these raised beds, that hold the soil into place. And also with a raised bed, it's its own separate entity, which means I have full control of the type of soil that I put in and how I improve it. So there'll be certain raised beds which are more dedicated to perennials, like I've got one for strawberries over there, that's where I put down a lot of wood chip because I am making that quite a fungal dominated soil. But for a raised bed like this, I'm just putting down well broken down compost, which is better for bacterially dominated soils. And I get that ability to almost micromanage the types of soil in these raised beds. And it also means that some beds might need less treatment than others, because I've got beds down the bottom which have really nicely developed soils. So that's what I like about raised beds with sides. I have that kind of full control about what is actually within these parameters. For me, I like raised beds with sides because they kind of give this area to work within. You've got almost this like mini wall or fence that's holding everything together. So it means in terms of that constant maintenance of putting 2 to 3 centimeters of compost on a yearly basis, it's really easy to kind of know how much I need in a designated area. So a bed like this might need a wheelbarrow full every year once it's fully set up and running. And it's so easy because none of the compost is spilling over, it's all in one place. So rather than compost spilling over into the paths that you then tread down, I'd rather have that compost in this area and try and build up the depth of really high quality soil that is full of biological life. No-dig gardening is very much about having minimal effort. And in terms of raised beds maintenance, all I really need to do every single year is make sure that I put the compost on the top, and that's it. Weeding is super easy. And one of the reasons why I love sides is because it allows me to have grass paths or grass nearby, and it's not going to encroach. This grass that I'm stood on right now, yes, it's a bit of a liability during winter when it gets a little bit slippery and muddy. It easily heals. Grass is almost like nature's version of a plaster. But what it means is that I'm never having to edge my beds because none of the grass is actually growing in, which means that it's really easy to keep these beds weed free. And that is something that I find really useful, especially in terms of no-dig gardening. A big argument for not having raised beds with sides is the fact that you've got to put in that initial upfront investment and the effort of building raised beds with sides, sourcing the materials, paying for them. This bed here, surprise, surprise, even has no bad chemical treatment. You can get organic wood preservatives that are chemical free. This is an original raised bed for the garden. This is about 19 years old. So I'm 22. The garden was made when I was 3 years old. So hopefully that gives you some perspective. Now, here we had some beds we had 3 beds, which you can see in the B-roll, which were bigger beds made out of big sleepers. You can get chemical-free sleepers as well. Those rotted, so decided to make the most of these planks here, which we had, and wherever possible, if I have resources left over or access to free resources, I will use them. I'll only expect these to last around 10 years or so at a push, but there are always other options. And for me, I actually feel in terms of the actual overall maintenance, I actually save a lot more time by having raised beds with sides than without. And that's my own personal thing, especially in terms of my situation. You can then get things, and these are a lot more expensive. So I'd be really careful, unless you know you're going to be growing in a particular place 20, 30 years, just be cautious. You can get these recycled plastic raised beds. These are chemically inert, so there's going to be no chemical leaching, but these will last you at least 50 years. You can also look at making raised beds out of things like bricks and building actual brick beds. Those are another long-lasting alternative. So I think in terms of choosing sides, there's a lot of options, and there's a lot of ways that you can actually be creative to find a style that works for you. But for me, the benefits of having sides outweighs the initial cost and effort of building them. Now, one little tip with growing in raised beds with sides, if you're interested in doing that, is to try and make all your raised beds from the get-go the same size, because it means that you might only need to replace one of the sides because another side might last another 3 or 4 years. And you can do that if you just stay with the same dimensions. it is really easy to just make those little fixes during winter when there isn't really anything else to do. And very often as gardeners, we almost find things that we need to do during winter to keep us sane. Something that I like about raised beds as well with sides is that it's really easy to add attachments. So here I added this trellis onto this bed around 3 or 4 years ago to grow some peas up, and you can see it's still pretty solid. That isn't going anywhere for another year or two at least. And by having the solid sides, we do the same with an A-frame. So we've got a really big A-frame that we put up every year for our runner beans. And we can put nails into the actual side and tie string to help strengthen it. So if you're looking at trying to build like pretty strong or big structures, it's almost like you've got this base on which you can use the sides of raised beds to your advantage to attach really strong trellises. And this is especially useful if you don't have deep soil, because you might want to push things into the ground instead, but you can't get it deep enough, so there isn't enough strength, and then there's a risk of wind blowing things over, like wind blowing over wigwams. So that's just it's kind of a benefit that isn't spoken about a lot, but for me, I absolutely love it, and I'm going to try and get more creative with that this year as well, so stay tuned. A point that some people quite rightly bring up is the fact that the outside areas of a raised bed with sides will dry out sooner than on the inside. Now, this is one of the strengths of no dig. You've got so much organic matter acting as a sponge to hold on to the moisture. Even though we've had very recently, in fact, some prolonged periods of dry weather, I haven't seen a noticeable difference of kind of yields between the outside and inside of the beds of the same crops. One thing I would suggest, if you are concerned about this though, is to actually turn that into an opportunity. In the middle part of the bed, you can grow crops that prefer to have more moisture, whereas on the outside, on the perimeter, you could grow almost like this encompassing border of things which perhaps like slightly drier conditions to grow in. For example, particular herbs or particular fruiting vegetables. And then you can get the best of both worlds. You can grow the things which prefer more moisture in the area that has more moisture, and the things that like things slightly drier and perhaps more free draining around the outside. So that means you've got multifunctional use from a single raised bed. Before I jump into the hotly debated topic of raised beds with sides and slugs, now just as a quick side note here, I honestly think that no-dig gardening in raised beds shows the power that no-dig has in terms of slug control and slug prevention. I just want to say kind of the main thing is why I choose to grow in raised beds with sides. It's because I have a very visual area to work with. I'm a very visual person, and I like to see that this is a perfect size. Perhaps it's a Capricorn in me, but it means that I can look at every bed almost as its own garden, which means it's very easy for me to plan. The sizes are never going to change, and that's what works for me. And at the end of the day, no matter where I end up in life, even if I'm growing on a bigger market garden that perhaps has beds in the ground without any sides, I am always going to have some amount of raised beds with sides, because I love the practicality and the intensiveness that growing in raised beds with sides offers, as well as the freedom of being able to do it in practically any situation. I just want to spend a moment talking about slugs, the gardener's favourite creature. I see a lot of almost this kind of finger pointing where people say, oh, you shouldn't have built raised beds with sides because they're just going to become slug hotels. And I fear that it does actually put off a lot of people from starting to grow food, especially if they have the best intentions. The truth about slugs is slugs go for your weakest plants. So this is where no dig really comes into strength, because with no dig, the whole goal is healthy soil. And no dig growing is perhaps one of the only ways that you can, well, it is basically the only way to have a truly healthy soil where you're not just accounting for minerals, but also the biology which makes the minerals available. And when you have healthier soil, you have healthier plants, which naturally fend off things like slugs, because perhaps the sugar content is too high for them to digest the leaves. Slugs and other things in nature tend to go for the weaker plants. So if you're growing the strongest, healthiest plants, you will see that naturally there will be a slug reduction. The other thing is when you use compost as a mulch, especially in the UK, you've kind of got this bare soil which slugs aren't so keen going over. Now, you've seen in my main garden where all of the paths are grass, and people are like, this just must be a slug nightmare. I found it really hard last year to find any proper visible damage of slugs, and the whole garden surrounds grass. There's longer grass, there's fields, there's barns and all sorts of pallets where slugs can hide underneath. The truth is that nature over time creates an equilibrium, and I believe in terms of slugs, it's more of a long-term strategy. There's a lot of short-term fixes you can do. I've done a whole video about 3 organic methods you can use to control slug issues in your garden in the short term, but for the long term, it's a 2-part method. It's firstly about promoting the health of your soil, and secondly, it's about building that natural biodiversity that your garden will continue to improve as it matures and as time progresses. So I think when done right, raised beds really aren't slug hotels. I know it because I've been gardening in a very wet part of Wales in UK, which is renowned for slug issues. And I just want to show you another side of the coin, which I don't think is spoken about enough. And I just kind of want to put it out there.